performance improvement, capacity building in the development context. Whatever we do in the name of the organization, ultimately, I am sure all of you would agree with me, that it should result in organizational performance improvement, whether it's training, learning, or what have you, whatever techniques, methods, tools. Ultimately, the management will be looking in for saying some perceptual development in the performance of the organization. This context is making this presentation. May I now request you, Mr. Matt Brown, to start with the presentation, please. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I'm your surprise for this session, because I wasn't on the schedule. I was on schedule for a different room. How do you propose this? Okay, can you hear me? Is it working? Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Matthew Brown. I work for this organization called World Learning, and in about 15 minutes, I would like to share with you a couple of different approaches that we use in working with organizations in other countries, mostly, to strengthen their performance in very, very different ways. By development, have I said that word yet? Yes, the development context. For us, the development context means countries that are recipients of international donor assistance. And I think you know that in the United States, this is where I'm from, the U.S. government offers most of its international assistance through contracting organizations.
Excuse me, Mr. Brown. Is it audible to the last person?
No.
Is it audible? So on?
No.
Better.
Yes or no?
No.
Can you help? Yeah, please improve your audio.
شو ارفع
Quick,
صوت شوي
yeah,
ارفع
please.
وجهي ارفع صوت
You want it higher?
ايه
Yes?
اوكي
Okay,
ايه
it's better.
اوكي
Okay. I don't have a lot of experience speaking in front of rooms this size, so maybe that's part of the problem. Anyway, World Learning has basically 4 different pieces. We began in 1932 as the Experiment in International Living, which still exists. It's still part of our programming. It's we offer summer high school exchange programs for American high school students going to other countries and for international high school students going to the U.S. We also offer the SIT Graduate School, going in the right order, SIT Study Abroad, which is a 1-semester program for students at U.S. universities to study in other countries. Both of these programs we have in many, many countries in the Middle East and North Africa and the rest of the world as well. The third part of our portfolio is the SIT Graduate Institute, which does international management, master's programs, training for teachers of languages, TESOL and relatives, and conflict resolution programs. And finally, my part of the organization is international development and exchange programs. And as I was saying before, when we talk about development, we mean the U.S. forms of assistance in other countries, and not development, I think, as some other people in this room mean when they talk about HR and internal organizational functions. The first approach that I'd like to talk to you about is one that we use more with very small non-governmental organizations in the developing world, in places like Nicaragua, Jamaica, Ethiopia, Liberia, places like that. And the second model is one that we use more with governmental institutions at the central level and at the local level. So local government, ministries, agencies, and things like that. And we're using that approach in places like Macedonia, also Nicaragua, the Republic of Georgia, the Republic of Kosovo, Cyprus, and some other places. Okay, everybody's favorite USAID. I have to mention that a lot of the work that we do in my part of World Learning is funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, which, in case some of you may not know, is the main government organ in the United States that provides assistance around the world. Are you all familiar with USAID? Some people hate it, some people love it. Anyway, it's how we get a lot of our funding. But in fact, we're trying very, very hard to diversify and to do some of the kinds of work that I'm talking about today with other funding. So if you want to be partners or if you have other ideas, that would be great. Okay, here are the actual names of the two approaches that we use. The first one is World Learning's own approach to organizational capacity building. We call it the Participatory Institutional Analysis Framework and Toolkit. The second one is something that USAID developed. It's called Human and Institutional Capacity Development. And interestingly, that model is based on the HPT model, which is Human Performance Technology, of ISPI, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the International Society for Performance Improvement. Very closely related. We use a lot of colored dots in this work. Okay. The first one that we use mostly with very small NGOs, the Participatory Institutional Analysis Framework, is a fully partnered approach that is structured around a facilitated self-assessment. And those words are all very, very important. Facilitated because it's not something that a small organization can usually do all by itself. It's something that requires a trained facilitator to go and help them with. But it's also very, very partnered. It's not something where we jump into a country or into an organization and do an independent analysis all by ourselves and then tell them what their problems are. It's a very, very partnered, collaborative approach. For a typical small organization like in Ethiopia, we use this with several organizations that have maybe 10 or 15 people in their personnel who work in their communities providing various services connected with HIV/AIDS. So that's a typical situation. A very poor community, a very small NGO with very few resources. And we go in there and we develop a partnership with this organization. And over the course of 2 or 3 or maybe 5 days, we work with them to do an analysis of how their status quo compares with where they want to be. We look at usually 7 or 8 different aspects of the functioning of the NGO. These are the aspects that we look at. All very, very familiar, I think, to everybody in this room. We have a preliminary list of questions that helps us. It's about 50 pages long, and we can choose different questions from it and adjust them according to the situation. And we look at these topics. This is an example from our matrix of questions. We look at the topics one by one, and we have discussions with all different people connected with the NGO, from inside in the management, from the board of directors, if there is one, to their constituencies, so people who benefit from their services, to their funders, if they have funders. We talk about these questions with all of these different groups, and we come to a consensus with the NGO about, again, the difference between where they are now and where they want to be. To help them give themselves some kind of an evaluation for each question, for each element, like human resources, or monitoring and evaluation, or service provision, we use this little chart that shows a range of the development of the organization from startup, or the very early stages, all the way up to, what do we call it? Maturing. Now, it's not so important to have a score, because this isn't, so that is nothing. It's not so important to give a number, because the most important thing in this case is for the NGO to come to its own understanding of what's strong and what's not so strong. The purpose is not to give them a 5 or a 6 or a 7. It's to show them in their own perception, according to this continuum, where they are, so they know where they want to develop further. Here's some examples. Again, I think it's very useful to see the kinds of organizations that we work with when we use this. A lot of small organizations working in HIV/AIDS, other aspects of civil society in different countries. Liberia, as I mentioned, with the health sector. And we've also used this a little bit with very, very small government institutions. Here we have a chart to show some of the capacity problems that we find, that we typically find, and some examples of pieces that go into the strategic plan or the organizational plan or the action plan of the organization. Again, probably nothing here that's such a mystery to anybody in this room, but for some of the NGOs that we work with, these ideas are very radical. Something as simple as, they work with volunteers and they train the volunteers, but then the volunteers disappear because they go to school or they get married, and then they lose the memory, the institutional memory of those volunteers. Well, we suggest, have you thought about keeping better records? Have you thought about keeping archives? Have you thought about developing manuals? And these can be very simple. They can be 1 page. But to some organizations, in places where literacy is a problem, where resources are a problem, where education is very weak, these can be very radical ideas. This is a photo. We went out to meet with commercial sex workers who were some of the constituencies of this organization. They were like clients, and it was very important to get their opinion about the NGO so we could work on strengthening certain aspects of their service. A coffee ceremony in Ethiopia, also a constituency meeting. People who were tired after lunch, so we asked them to stand up. Thank you. Okay. How's my time? Okay. So that's the first model, and as I said, we use it mostly with very, very small non-governmental organizations. I'll be happy to answer more questions about that later. The second model that I want to talk to you about is this USAID designed model based on the principles of human performance technology. This came from a need that USAID saw in connection with training. USAID spends, hundreds of millions of dollars every year to provide long-term and short-term training for professionals and students and others around the world. In fact, I myself managed programs like this in the Balkans for about 12 years, so I'm very, very familiar with these programs. But what they found was we were sending or providing training to individuals who did not have a specific place afterwards to apply what they had learned. I'm sure that's very, very familiar to a lot of HR people, because we always want to provide training when we think there's some kind of a capacity problem or performance problem in the organization. But training is not always the right answer. Training is only the right answer if the problem is related to knowledge and skills and the role of that knowledge and skills in an institutional context. So USAID was looking for a way to push training, good training, in a direction that would be measurably useful inside organizations and institutions. And they developed this thing called Human Institution and Capacity Development. I have these things up here to show that part of the thinking was to be more in line with the Accra Agreement and the Paris Declaration and other policies, US policies and international policies, pushing for more of a focus on institutions in development and more of a focus on building the capacity of local players to develop their own development activities. This is all part of that same kind of thing. This is USAID's definition of HICD. In short, it's a very rigid model that partners with institutions to find gaps between, similarly to the other model, gaps between where they are now in their performance and where they want to be. And then also design strategies to get them to move from one point to the next point. And also very important, one element in this approach is to help the institutions develop their own internal systems to continue to monitor their performance and make changes as they go along. So performance management, performance monitoring, and there are probably 10 other names for this, but in many of the institutions that we work with, this is familiar to you, but it's a radical idea to a lot of them. This is the model in pictures. We're not going to go into detail, of course, but the reason USAID has so many clear steps in this model is that it can be very politically tricky. So they want things to be as organized as possible and say, these are the necessary steps, and if institutions want to go through this process with us, these are the steps that have to be followed. In comparison with the other model, this takes a lot longer. It goes a lot deeper. It's much more serious research about the outputs of the organization. Much more data is collected. More skills are necessary for the team that works on this, because we're collecting qualitative and quantitative data so that you have a baseline and you can make changes and then compare the results with the baseline afterwards. But basically, at its heart, this model is very similar to the other model. It's a question of working closely with an organization or an institution to compare where they are with where they want to be, and then finding strategies together to get them to move from one point to the next. More photographs. Georgia. Our list of countries. Here again, examples. Maybe not the best examples, but the first ones that I could think of when I was doing the presentation. On the left are performance gaps that are very, very typical that we find when we work with institutions, and then some typical solutions. For example, with one institution in Macedonia, it was called the State Education Inspectorate. They had a new mandate, and they asked us to come in, or they asked USAID, USAID asked us to come in to work with them to figure out what they needed to do in order to be able to perform their new mandate, which was very different from their previous mandate. And our research together with the institution showed that their inspectors simply did not have the skills and the knowledge to do their new job. So that was a very logical time to use training, because sometimes training is the right answer. In another institution, we found that this was a Ministry of Economy in one country, and we found that 4 different divisions within that institution all had responsibility for communications with the public. And they were fighting with each other and giving different messages, and everybody considered this to be a performance problem. And one of the solutions was simply to restructure, to centralize communications in one location and avoid all that conflict and double messages. Yeah, well, you can see for yourselves another couple of examples. Pretty typical stuff, but it's amazing how radical and how surprising some of these things seem to the organizations that we work with. I can provide these useful links if anybody is interested, or you would be happy to down. One is if you feel like taking a quick course in how to use HICD, that's available here. Soon, World Learning will have our participatory institutional analysis tools online, and you can read about those as well. And a couple of other useful things there. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Master, for the additional time. All of you would be happy to know that all these speakers have made their excellent experiences. I'm sure every one of us has picked up a point or two from each of the presentations. Now, before I open the first question answer session, one of the views which I have learned in my humble service of about 40 years, working mostly in industry and then in the academic world, I would like to share with you. Now, the word strategic thinking, basically it is said, you think, so you are. Please understand. You think, so you are. You breathe, so you are living. The moment you stop thinking, there is no difference between a dead man and a live man. So that is the importance of thinking. So that is the importance of just thinking. What is the importance of strategic thinking? I share one important experience, which I had while I was working with one of the largest steel companies in India. The construction started and about $3 billion investment had gone in. Nothing was coming up. And there was a gloom everywhere in the minds of all the people. And the government also had started to close it down out of disgust. At this point of time, the management of the
quality time is appreciation expressed by giving a person undivided attention, where you don't have your phone out and you're saying, so how's the project going? It's when you come in and you find out what's going on for them. The person that appreciates quality time just needs you to listen to them. They don't necessarily need to be complimented, they just need you to listen and maybe debrief. The next one is acts of service, which requires action. Some people are encouraged when you help them, more so than when you compliment them. They are encouraged by helping them. Like a man helped me hand out these things. I'll bet you his language of appreciation is acts of service, because he likes to do things for people, and he feels encouraged when people do things for him. So it would be good to help him with his projects, come alongside him, and what can I do for you to help your life work better? Or what can I do to see that your project is on track? Just a manager can help a person in this area by seeing that this person has the resources and the equipment and the support they need to get what they need done. I'll bet many secretaries have the language preference of acts of service, because that's what they do. Then, of course, there's tangible gifts. The fourth language, appreciation. People have this preference, or feel very encouraged by gifts. And it's not about the value of the gift, Although, you know, a Ferrari would be a nice gift to get for your boss, right?
Red Ferrari.
Red, yes. Or a blue Aston Martin, green Aston Martin. But it's not within the, because it's not within most people's budget, right? But tangible gifts are not about the value of the gift, but the fact that you took, but that if it's personalized, if it's a magazine subscription that they like, if it's tickets to a show that they appreciate, or tickets to the Formula One race in Bahrain next week. That would really crank me up. But anyway, tangible gifts are things that show value to the person individually. So it's not a company T-shirt or another company mug or
individuals who had participated in the assessment center process and had been promoted into the position, the level to which they were assessed, manager level. And what we did is we took that list of individuals. We didn't show the scores to management. We said, okay, we'd like you to identify those individuals that are the top performers, those individuals. We had them actually placed in 4 quartiles. Top performer, then 2 middle quartiles, and then a bottom quartile. And then when they went through that process, and then we compared those, the assessment center results that we had for those individuals, and that's how we got the correlation. That the 4 times more likely to be in the top quartile in the assessment center score, you're also the top quartile for performance.
Any more questions? Okay, this brings up to the end of this session. Thank you very much for being with us. And excuse me, wait. Before we go out, I would like to present a small token of appreciation to our speakers, to take with them and remember this event. And thanks for sharing with us this valuable information. If there are 3 things I walk out from this presentation myself, is
this one is applied all over the country, but the one which is unique, we have a unique system, the National Guard, which is 4 years promoting. You know, the 3 years are the minimum years to be promoted. You can't promote for 3 years. Okay, but the system just to equalize the number of service and the parallel line with the service line. Okay. The third question is regarding the fitness program. Yeah. One of the conditions to be promoted is to pass the exam for the